Gravity has never cared about straight lines. By the time the deluge arrived, the Earth already reeked of copper, diesel exhaust, and blind panic beneath a sky the color of an old bruise. The locals had spent months treating his overgrown trenches and rotting wood chips like a laughable, eccentric hobby. But as the floodwaters rushed in, the wild contours of his land suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Roland's hands were a topographical map of bad decisions. The calluses at the base of his fingers felt like cured leather, and there was a permanent crescent of black earth packed tight beneath his thumbnails that no amount of scrubbing with the stiff bristled brush by the kitchen sink could dislodge. He sat on the tailgate of his rust-pocked Ford, staring out over the 40 acres that the county tax assessor generously classified as agricultural land. To anyone driving down County Road 9, Roland's property looked like an abandoned lot that had decided to violently rewild itself. There were no neat, laser-leveled rows of corn stretching toward the horizon. There was no bare, chemically scorched brown earth waiting obediently for seed. Instead, the hill was a chaotic riot of towering sunflowers drooping under their own weight, tangled thickets of vetch, aggressively spreading clover, and massive, meandering mounds of earth and rotting timber that Roland called swales. It looked messy. It looked poor. "Looks like a damn weed trap, Artie." Roland didn't turn around. He knew the voice. It was Tom Miller, leaning against the fence line. Tom smelled faintly of expensive cologne and the sharp, sterile tang of anhydrous ammonia. Tom farmed 2,000 acres of conventional soy and corn on the flatlands below Roland's Hill. Tom drove a $250,000 combine with a climate-controlled cab and GPS steering. Roland drove a tractor that required a shot of starting fluid and a prayer to turn over. "It's a polyculture, Tom," Roland said, his voice flat, exhausted. He didn't have the energy for the argument today. His lower back was radiating a dull, throbbing heat from shoveling compost since 5 a.m. "It's a hobby, is what it is," Tom chuckled, a wet, phlegmy sound. "You're breeding pests up there. Mites, aphids, God knows what else. I had to spray an extra pass of fungicide on my north acreage just because of the spores blowing off your rotting logs. You can't feed a county with a science experiment, Artie. When are you going to give it up? Sell the parcel to me. I'll bulldoze those stupid dirt bumps, grade it out, and give you a fair price." Roland finally looked at him. Tom was a large man, his face flushed pink with good blood pressure and unshakable confidence. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man who believed entirely in the post-war gospel of chemistry and steel. He liked control. Roland, on the other hand, had realized long ago that control was a delusion. "They aren't dirt bumps," Roland muttered, sliding off the tailgate. His knees popped audibly. "They're hugelkultur mounds. They hold water. We got drainage tiles for water, Artie. Pipe it out, send it to the river. You're just breeding mosquitoes." Tom shook his head, looking at Roland with genuine, infuriating pity. "Suit yourself, but the bank's gonna take it before the weeds do." Tom walked away, his heavy boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. Roland stood alone in the humid morning air, feeling a sudden, sharp spike of doubt lodge itself under his ribs. Tom wasn't wrong about the bank. Roland was drowning in debt. He had taken over the farm after his father died of a sudden stroke, inheriting soil that was basically hardpan clay, dead dirt, compacted by decades of heavy machinery and stripped of life. The first time Roland tried to dig a post hole, the iron bar bounced off the earth with a sharp clink, vibrating up his arms and jarring his teeth. It had taken him 6 years to bring the soil back from the dead. 6 years of hauling municipal leaf litter, begging local arborists to dump their wood chips on his driveway, planting deep-rooted radishes just to let them rot in the ground and break up the clay. He walked out into the chest-high mess of his front paddock. The air here smelled entirely different from the road. Down by Tom's fields, the air was dusty, carrying a sterile, chemical static. Up here, it smelled like a damp basement, rich, fungal, alive. Roland dropped to his knees, not caring about the damp seeping through his denim. He dug his bare hands into the side of one of his swales. The soil didn't crumble into dust. It clumped. It was dark. The color of dark roast coffee, bound together by the sticky exudates of billions of microbes and the fine white threads of mycelium running through the decaying wood chips at the core. He squeezed a handful and it held its shape like a sponge. "It's working," he thought. "The soil is breathing." But breathing didn't pay the mortgage. He wiped his dirty hands on his jeans, leaving dark smears across the thighs. He was 38 years old, single, perpetually exhausted, and widely considered the village idiot by men who made their living dominating the earth. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the silence of the old farmhouse pressed in on him, he wondered if they were right. Maybe he was just playing in the dirt. Maybe it was all a colossal waste of time. He stood up, feeling a sharp twinge in his lumbar spine, and walked back to the house. He needed a beer, and he needed a shower. He didn't know that the atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean was currently collapsing into a low-pressure system that was going to test every single rotting log on his property. It started with the heat. By mid-August, the air didn't just feel hot. It felt solid. It was a wet, oppressive weight that settled over the valley, making the horizon shimmer like oil on asphalt. The cicadas screamed in the trees, a deafening metallic whine that drilled into Roland's skull as he tried to secure the plastic sheeting on his high tunnels. The radio in his shed had been crackling with static all morning, the local meteorologist's voice sounding tight, an octave higher than usual. An unprecedented convergence of a tropical remnant and a stalled cold front. Residents in low-lying areas of the basin should prepare for historic rainfall. Roland spit a mouthful of dust onto the dry grass. He was struggling with a nylon ratchet strap, his fingers slipping on the sweaty metal mechanism. The sky to the west had turned a sickly, bruised yellow, the color of an old contusion. The wind hadn't started yet. The stillness was worse. It felt like the valley was holding its breath. Down the hill, the agricultural machine was operating at peak efficiency. Tom Miller had a crew of hired hands out in the fields, securing equipment, moving tractors to higher ground, clearing the massive concrete drainage culverts that lined the county roads. They worked with the practiced, aggressive speed of men who believed they could engineer their way out of anything. Roland looked at his own defenses. They were pathetic. He didn't have concrete culverts. He had trenches, dozens of them, dug along the contours of the hillside, meant to catch rainwater and force it to sink slowly into the earth rather than running off. But he had designed them for normal rain. Spring showers, a summer thunderstorm. If the radio was right, they were about to get dumped with a foot of water in less than 24 hours. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his exhaustion. He dropped the ratchet strap and ran to the barn. He grabbed a shovel. He didn't know what he was going to do with it, but his body demanded action. He ran to the lowest swale, the one holding back the earth just above the county road. If this blew out, it would send tons of mud and rotting wood straight down onto the asphalt. He started digging furiously, trying to deepen the overflow spillway. The sweat poured off his forehead, stinging his eyes, mixing with the dirt on his face. His breath came in ragged, jagged gasps. "You're a fool," his internal voice screamed, the shovel biting into the earth. "You built a mudslide. You built a weapon that's going to wash right over Tom Miller's pristine fields, and you're going to be sued into oblivion." The blister on his right palm, half healed from the week before, tore open. He felt the slick, hot slide of blood against the wooden handle of the shovel, but he didn't stop. He was panting, cursing out loud, the words swallowed by the vast, heavy silence of the impending storm. Suddenly, the wind hit. It didn't build up. It arrived like a physical blow. Roland was thrown off balance, stumbling backward into the deep clover. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a matter of seconds. The sickly yellow sky violently transitioned to a churning, charcoal gray. A loud crack echoed from the top of the hill. Roland snapped his head up to see the plastic on his primary high tunnel rip perfectly down the center seam. The wind caught the thick polyethylene, snapping it like a giant whip before tearing it completely off the metal hoops. Hundreds of dollars of materials and weeks of work, gone in 3 seconds. He scrambled to his feet, tasting copper in the back of his throat. He ran toward the tunnel, thinking wildly that he could grab the plastic, pin it down. But another gust hit, carrying a barrage of fine grit and small pebbles that stung his face like birdshot. He threw his arms up to protect his eyes. "Damn it! Damn it all!" He screamed into the wind, though he couldn't even hear his own voice. He gave up. There was no heroics here. No man versus nature. Nature was going to do exactly what it wanted, and Roland was just a soft, fleshy thing standing in its way. He dropped the shovel, turned, and bolted for the farmhouse. He slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing his weight against it as the wind tried to pull it back open. He locked the deadbolt with trembling, bloody fingers. The inside of the house was dark, the power already out. The silence inside was instantly shattered by the sound of the house itself. The old timber frame groaned loudly, a deep, structural complaining. The sash windows rattled violently in their frames. Roland walked into the kitchen, his boots leaving muddy, bloody tracks on the faded linoleum. He didn't care. He opened the cabinet under the sink, bypassed the cleaning supplies, and pulled out a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon. He didn't bother with a glass. He took a long, burning pull directly from the bottle, coughing as the harsh liquor clawed its way down his throat. He slumped into the wooden chair by the kitchen window, staring out at the darkening chaos. He felt a profound, crushing sense of failure. Tom was right. The neighbors were right. He had wasted his life playing in the dirt. When the sun came up tomorrow, his farm would be gone, washed down the hill in a river of expensive mud. He took another drink, closed his eyes, and waited for the end. The rain didn't fall. It collapsed. There was no buildup of polite drops tapping against the glass. One moment the air was full of howling wind and flying debris, and the next, a solid sheet of gray water erased the outside world. The sound was immediately terrifying. It sounded like a freight train was idling on the roof. Roland had to cover his ears, but the vibration of the water hitting the house traveled through the floorboards and up into his boots. Water immediately began to force its way through the microscopic gaps in the window sashes. Roland watched dumbly as a dark stain spread across the peeling wallpaper beneath the kitchen window, dripping steadily onto the floor. He didn't move to grab a towel. There was no point. Lightning flashed, a blinding strobe light blue that lit up the valley for a fraction of a second, followed instantly by a crack of thunder that rattled the plates in the cupboards. In that brief flash of light, Roland pressed his face against the cold, wet glass to see the hill. It was a nightmare. The sheer volume of water was incomprehensible. The contours of his land, usually subtle and rolling, were now starkly defined by rivers of brown water rushing down the slopes. He waited for the collapse. He gripped the edge of the kitchen table, his knuckles white, his breath fogging the glass. He knew the physics. Soil can only hold so much water before the pores fill, before the friction between the particles vanishes, turning solid earth into a liquid slurry. His swales, those massive mounds of dirt and wood, were acting as dams, and dams break. Another flash of lightning. Roland's eyes darted down the hill, toward the county road and Tom Miller's fields beyond. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Tom's fields, those perfectly flat, bare, chemically treated expanses of dirt, were dissolving. There was nothing to hold the soil. No roots, no organic matter, no structure. The rain hammered the bare earth, instantly sealing the surface and preventing any water from soaking in. The runoff gathered speed, pulling the topsoil with it. It looked like a massive, shallow, brown ocean moving laterally across the landscape. The water hit the million-dollar concrete drainage ditches, filled them in less than a minute, and simply ignored them, pouring violently over the asphalt of County Road 9. Roland watched a heavy steel gate at the edge of Tom's property snap off its hinges and disappear into the churning brown water. The flatlands were becoming a lake. My hill is next, Roland thought, his chest tight. When my swales breach, it'll take out the road completely. He shifted his gaze back up to his own property. He couldn't just sit here. The anxiety was a physical pressure in his skull. He grabbed a heavy canvas coat from the hook by the door, not bothering to zip it, and shoved his way out onto the covered back porch. The roar of the rain hit him like a physical wall. The spray from the roof violently soaked his jeans in seconds. The air was freezing, shocking his system. He grabbed the wooden railing, leaning out to look at the massive swale sitting 20 yards from the porch. The trench behind the mound was full. It was a raging, boiling pool of water. It was cresting the top of the earthwork. Here it goes, Roland thought, bracing himself. It's going to blow. The water spilled over the top of the mound, but it didn't blow out the earth. It didn't tear away chunks of mud. Roland squinted through the driving rain, wiping the water from his eyes. The water was spilling over, yes, but the mound itself wasn't moving. The thick, chaotic tangle of deep-rooted comfrey, the network of clover, the aggressive, messy weeds that Tom had mocked, they were acting like rebar. The roots were holding the soil together with an iron grip. More importantly, he realized as he watched, the water in the trench wasn't just sitting there. It was swirling downward. The spongy, heavily mulched, radically uncompacted earth beneath his feet was doing exactly what it had evolved to do over millions of years before plows were invented. It was drinking. The rotting wood chips at the core of the mounds were acting like massive subterranean sponges, expanding, pulling the water down into the water table instead of letting it sheet across the surface. Roland stepped off the porch, the water instantly rising over the ankles of his boots. He walked blindly toward the closest swale. The rain beat against his shoulders, heavy and bruising. He reached the mound and fell to his knees in the mud. He shoved his hands into the earth. It was wet, incredibly wet, but it wasn't soup. His fingers found the thick, fibrous root of a sunflower, holding fast in the dark, fragrant soil. The earth wasn't washing away. It was absorbing the impact. He knelt there in the storm, the rain washing the blood and dirt from his hands, staring down the hill. Below him, the county road was completely submerged. Tom Miller's immaculate, sterile empire was drowning, a victim of its own efficiency. But up here, on the messy, overgrown, chaotic hill, the soil held. Roland let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, immediately drowned out by the roar of the sky. He wasn't a hero. He was just a tired man in a wet coat. But as he looked at the water sinking into the ground he had spent 7 years building, he finally knew he wasn't crazy. The rain stopped at exactly 4:14 a.m. Roland knew because he was sitting on the floor of his kitchen, his back pressed against the humming refrigerator, watching the battery-powered clock on the wall tick off the seconds. When the deluge finally quit, the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, ringing in his ears, like the atmospheric pressure had suddenly dropped out of the bottom of the world. The house groaned, settling into its saturated foundation. Somewhere in the walls, water dripped with a steady, maddening tink, tink, tink. Roland didn't move until the sky in the east turned the color of dirty dishwater. His joints felt filled with broken glass as he forced himself up from the linoleum. He pushed the kitchen door open, shoving hard against the pile of wet leaves and shattered branches that the wind had wedged against the frame. The morning air smelled like violence. It was a sharp, mineral scent, pulverized ozone, shredded pine needles, and the deep, sulfurous stench of anaerobic mud churned up from the bottom of the valley. The humidity was a thick blanket, clinging to Roland's face as he stepped out onto the porch. He looked up the hill first. It wasn't a pristine victory. The storm had exacted a brutal toll. His secondary high tunnel was entirely gone. The metal hoops bent flat to the earth like crushed ribs. The heirloom tomatoes he had spent 4 months nursing from seed were beaten into a green, pulpy smear against the wood chips. His elderberry bushes were stripped naked, their leaves plastered against the side of the barn. But the hill itself, the bones of the farm, was still there. Roland walked out into the mess. His boots sank into the wood chips, but there was a distinct lack of the horrifying, sucking sound of deep mud. The earth was soft, spongy, giving way slightly under his weight before pushing back. He reached the primary swale. The trench behind the mound, which just hours ago had been a raging torrent of brown water, was now a calm, reflecting pool, and the water wasn't brown anymore. It was cloudy, but clear enough to see the drowned, decaying stalks of last year's clover at the bottom. The wood chips and the roots had acted as a massive biological filter. They hadn't just held the soil, they had stripped the sediment out of the moving water, trapping the nutrients on the hill where they belonged, letting only the clean water sink down into the water table. Roland let out a long, ragged exhale. A tight, vibrating knot in his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for 7 years began to loosen. He turned his back to the hill and looked down at the valley. The relief vanished, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. County Road 9 no longer existed. In its place was a shallow, slow-moving river of opaque, gelatinous sludge. The ditch systems that the county had spent millions engineering were entirely buried beneath tons of displaced topsoil, and Tom Miller's farm was a graveyard. Roland started walking down the hill. He didn't want to gloat. He didn't feel any triumphant surge of, "I told you so." The devastation below was too vast, too total, to feel anything but a sick, hollow empathy. When he reached the bottom of his property line, the physical difference in the ground was jarring. On his side of the wire fence, the soil was damp and bound by roots. On the other side, stepping onto Tom's land, Roland's boot immediately sank 8 inches into a slick, featureless pudding. The soybeans were gone. Not flattened, not damaged. Gone. The sheer velocity of the water running off the bare, compacted earth had acted like a pressure washer. It had stripped away the top 4 inches of topsoil, the only fertile layer Tom had left, the layer he kept on life support with chemical fertilizers, leaving behind a scarred, uneven landscape of pale, hard-pan clay. Hundreds of acres of crops, hundreds of thousands of dollars, washed straight into the local watershed. Roland saw the silhouette of a man standing about a quarter-mile out, near where the county drainage culvert used to be. It was Tom. Roland waded into the muck. The mud sucked at his boots, a heavy, desperate vacuum that required a concentrated physical effort to break with every step. The air down here didn't smell like damp earth. It smelled like diesel fuel, drowned worms, and the sharp, chemical tang of liquid nitrogen that had washed out of the soil. Tom was staring at his $250,000 combine. The massive green machine was parked on what was supposed to be a slight rise, but the water had undercut the bank. The combine was pitched forward at a grotesque 45-degree angle, its massive front tires buried up to the axles in a depression of silty sludge. The engine compartment was caked in a thick layer of brown scum. It would require a crane just to pull it out, and the electronics were undoubtedly fried. "Tom," Roland said softly, stopping a few feet away. Tom didn't jump. He just slowly turned his head. He looked 10 years older than he had yesterday morning. His face, usually ruddy and flushed with confident authority, was pale and slack. The expensive rain jacket he wore was smeared with clay. "The insurance adjuster," Tom started, his voice a dry, papery rasp. He cleared his throat and tried again. "The insurance guy on the phone. He said he can't get a drone up until tomorrow. Wind's still too unpredictable." He looked back at the combine. "I told him he doesn't need a drone. I told him to just look in the damn river. That's where my farm is." Roland didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. You don't offer platitudes to a man standing in the corpse of his livelihood. The water just... Tom raised a shaking hand, tracing a line in the empty air. "It didn't even slow down, Artie. It hit the ground and just kept moving. Took the seed, took the spray, took the dirt. The ditch backed up in 10 minutes. Then it just sheared the top layer right off." Tom finally turned fully toward Roland. His eyes tracked down to Roland's boots, which were muddy, but not caked in the thick, suffocating paste that covered Tom's legs. Then Tom looked up past Roland, toward the messy, chaotic, overgrown hill. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a harsh, flat light over the valley. In that light, the contrast was violent. Tom's flatlands were a barren brown moonscape. Roland's hill was battered, bruised, and tangled, but it was brilliantly, defiantly green. "Your bumps held," Tom whispered, the words sounding like they physically hurt his throat to produce. "They're swales, Tom," Roland said gently. "And yeah, the roots held." Tom stared at the hill for a long, unbroken minute. The silence stretched out, filled only by the sound of displaced water trickling through the ruined fields. "I thought you were a damn fool," Tom said, his voice cracking. He didn't sound angry. He sounded entirely broken. "I thought you were just playing in the dirt. But my dirt is gone, Artie. It's just gone." Tom suddenly dropped to his knees right there in the mud. He didn't care about the expensive jacket or the cold water seeping through his jeans. He drove his hands into the slick, pale clay beneath the top layer of sludge. He pulled up a handful of it. It was lifeless, gray, and slick as modeling clay. No worms, no roots, nothing breathing. Roland watched the older man stare at the dead earth in his hands. Roland felt his own exhaustion hitting him in waves, the adrenaline of the storm fully metabolizing, leaving behind nothing but heavy, aching bones. He took a step forward, the suction of the mud popping loudly. "Come on up to the house, Tom," Roland said, reaching down. "I've got coffee. Power's out, but I have a camp stove. It's hot." Tom looked at Roland's offered hand for a long time. Then, slowly, heavily, he reached out and took it. 3 days later, the heat returned with a vengeance. The weather front that had stalled over the valley finally broke, replaced by a searing, cloudless pressure cooker. The temperature spiked to 95 degrees. Down in the valley, The transformation of Tom Miller's land was horrifying to watch. Without any organic matter to hold moisture, the gelatinous sludge baked in the sun. Within 48 hours, the top layer dried out completely, shrinking and cracking into massive geometric plates like a dried-up riverbed in a desert. The edges of the clay curled upward, hard as ceramic tiles. When the wind blew, it picked up the fine, powdery dust from the bare earth and sent it swirling across the valley in choking brown clouds. Up on Rowland's Hill, the dynamic was entirely different. The surface of his swales was dry, yes. The top layer of wood chips felt warm to the touch. But beneath that 1-inch crust of mulch, the earth was cool, dark, and saturated. The massive amount of water trapped in the decaying wood and the spongy soil was slowly evaporating, creating a localized microclimate. While the valley baked, Rowland's Hill breathed. Rowland spent those 3 days doing triage. It was brutal, heartbreaking work. He had to take a machete to his ruined tomatoes, chopping the pulpy mess down and throwing it into the compost bays. He spent 8 hours with bolt cutters and a sledgehammer, dismantling the twisted metal skeleton of his ruined high tunnel. He lost his primary cash crop for the season. The financial hit was going to be severe. He would have to call the bank, ask for an extension, beg for leniency. But as he swung the machete, chopping the dead vegetation and letting it fall right back onto the soil to rot, he felt a strange, solid peace. The system worked. The bank might take the land, but they couldn't say the land was dead. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Rowland was sitting on his porch, drinking a tepid beer and staring at a clipboard of ruined financial projections, when a White County pickup truck slowly navigated the debris-strewn driveway. The truck parked, and 2 men got out. One was Dave, the local agricultural extension agent, a guy who usually looked at Rowland with mild, bureaucratic annoyance. The other was Tom Miller. Dave carried a clipboard and a long stainless steel soil probe. Tom carried nothing. He looked rested, but there was a quietness to him that hadn't been there before the storm. The bluster was gone. "Artie," Dave said, walking up the steps. He looked around the property, his eyes lingering on the massive, intact swales holding back the earth. "Got a minute?" "I've got nothing but minutes, Dave," Rowland said, setting his beer down. "Crops are pretty much gone." "Yeah, I see that," Dave said, stepping onto the porch. He tapped his pen against his clipboard. "Look, I'm doing the FEMA assessments for the county. Up and down the valley, it's a total loss. Catastrophic topsoil washout. We're looking at years of remediation for the conventional guys. But," Dave paused, looking uncomfortable. He cleared his throat. "I pulled the satellite data from before the storm and the drone footage from yesterday. Artie, your property didn't just survive. It acted as a buffer." Dave pointed the pen down toward the road. "The hydrology report shows that if your hill had given way, if it had shed water at the same velocity as the rest of the slope, it would have completely taken out the bridge on County Road 9. Your soil absorbed roughly 400,000 gallons of water that otherwise would have hit the infrastructure below." Rowland stared at him. He looked at Tom. Tom was looking at the ground. "The county is reevaluating the zoning," Dave continued, shifting his weight. "We've got disaster relief funds coming in, mostly to dredge the rivers and rebuild the roads. But there's a federal grant for erosion control infrastructure. I want to classify your earthworks under that grant, Artie. It won't cover your lost crops, but it'll pay you for the structural benefit your land provided to the county. It's enough to keep the bank off your back for a couple of years." Rowland felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind his eyes. He swallowed hard, looking out over the chaotic, messy, beautiful tangle of his front paddock. The bank wasn't going to take it. He wasn't going to lose the dirt. "I'll sign whatever you need, Dave," Rowland managed to say, his voice thick. "I'll leave the paperwork on the table," Dave said, clearly eager to escape the emotional weight of the moment. He set the clipboard down. "I'll go grab a soil core sample from the lower swale for the file. Be right back." Dave walked off the porch, leaving Rowland and Tom alone. Tom walked over to the porch railing, leaning his heavy forearms against the wood. He looked out over the hill, then down at the cracked, baked desert of his own farm in the distance. "Insurance is paying out," Tom said quietly. "Total loss on the crop. But they don't insure topsoil, Artie. They insure the yield. I've got the money to buy seed for next year, but I ain't got the dirt to put it in. It's just clay. I pour nitrogen on it. The next rain will just wash it straight into the river." Rowland leaned back in his chair. He didn't offer pity, Pity was useless to a farmer. "So what are you going to do?" Roland asked. Tom turned his head. His eyes were bloodshot, weary. "I remember when your dad died. I remember what this hill looked like. It was hardpan, dead, same as what I'm looking at down there right now." Tom stepped away from the railing and walked over to Roland. The older man stood there, stripped of his ego, stripped of the mechanical arrogance that had defined his entire life. "How did you start?" Tom asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a plea. Roland looked at Tom. He thought about the $250,000 combine stuck in the mud. He thought about the chemical salesman Tom used to play golf with. Then he stood up. "Come here," Roland said. He walked off the porch, Tom following heavily behind him. Roland led him to the nearest swale. He didn't grab a shovel. He dropped to his knees in the deep clover and drove his bare hands into the side of the mound. He dug past the dry crust of the wood chips, plunging his fingers deep into the core of the earthwork. He pulled out a massive two-handed clump of earth. It was nearly black. It smelled like the deep woods after a spring rain. It was crawling with red wiggler worms, and thick, white threads of fungal mycelium bound the rotting wood and dirt together into a spongy, cohesive mass. Roland held it out to Tom. "You don't start with a tractor, Tom," Roland said, his voice steady. "And you don't start with fertilizer." Tom reached out. His large, calloused hands, used to gripping heavy steel steering wheels and hydraulic levers, cupped the dirt gently. He brought it closer to his face. He felt the moisture, the structure. He saw a worm blindly burrowing back into the darkness of the clump. "You start with the rot," Roland said, wiping his filthy hands on his jeans. "You bring in organic matter, leaves, wood chips, manure, whatever you can find. You spread it out, and you let it die. You feed the things you can't see." Tom squeezed the soil. It didn't crumble into dust. It didn't smear into sludge. It compressed, then slowly expanded, holding its shape. "It takes time," Roland warned him, the cynicism creeping back into his voice. "It's ugly. The neighbors are going to laugh at you. They're going to call it a weed patch. It'll take 5 years before you see a real yield. Can you stomach that?" Tom Miller looked down at his ruined empire in the valley. He looked at the cracked, dead clay that he had spent his life dominating, only to watch it abandon him in a single night. Then he looked at the living, breathing handful of earth in his palms. "Artie," Tom said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, "I don't think I have a choice anymore." Roland nodded slowly. He felt the familiar, dull ache in his lower back, the permanent reminder of the thousands of hours he had spent moving dirt by hand. There was no finish line. Tomorrow, he still had to rebuild his tunnels. He still had to plant the winter cover crop. He still had to fight the weeds. But as he watched Tom Miller carefully place the clump of living soil back onto the mound, patting it down with a strange, newfound reverence, Roland knew one thing for certain. He wasn't crazy, and he wasn't alone anymore. The storm had washed away everything that was fake, everything that was propped up by arrogance and chemistry. It had scoured the valley down to the absolute truth. And the truth was simple. When the sky falls, the only thing that saves you is your roots. Roland turned back toward the farmhouse, the sun warm on his shoulders. He needed to find his other shovel. Tom had a lot of digging to do. The storm stripped the valley down to its bones, proving that true resilience isn't engineered, it's grown from the dirt up. Roland's messy, stubborn hill survived because it worked with nature, not against it. And now, a new chapter begins for the whole valley. If this story of gritty survival and returning to the roots resonated with you, please hit the like button, share this video with someone who appreciates the raw truth of farming, and subscribe so you don't miss our next story.